Okay. Thanks, everybody, for joining us today at the Attorney Lounge. So today our guest is Aloke Chakravarty. He's a partner at Snell and Wilmer and co-chair of Snell's Investigations, Government Enforcement, and White Collar Protection Practice Group. Al is also a former state, federal, and international investigator, prosecutor, and trial attorney, and most notably was responsible for the prosecution and conviction of the surviving brother who was responsible for the Boston Marathon bombing. Thanks, Al, for joining us today.
Great to be with you, Brian.
Al and I are friends. We go back a little bit. We've worked on a couple of cases together, and always a pleasure working with you and with this little new venture that I'm taking on. I appreciate you being a guinea pig for me on this podcast.
Yeah, I was so happy to do it. Not only to support you, but just think it's so cool that everybody can kind of create, not everybody, but a lot of people can create, platforms for themselves. And I can't think of anyone who deserves one and that I would tune into more than you. And I love the kind of inspiration behind it too.
No, I appreciate that. The inspiration behind it comes from Snell, as a matter of fact. I think I probably told you, but the Attorney Lounge, we had that at Snell when I started, and that was a really helpful place for me to go and meet attorneys and talk about. We would talk about, sometimes substantive issues, but more often than not, I would just talk about, where should I buy a house? How do you get financing for a house? Should I be saving for my 401k? All these sort of things that when you're just a young kid getting started, you just don't, you don't know anything. Not that I know much more today, but it was a helpful place to go and sort of talk to people and learn about their careers and how they got started and pick their brain for any sort of advice. And so that's kind of the idea behind this. I'm hopeful that a lot of students will listen to it and get some inspiration too, in terms of, pathways to a successful career in law. And so with that being the case, and I really want to talk about the Boston Marathon bombing case. That's fascinating, obviously. But before we get there, kind of with the theme of the show, tell us about your background and sort of how you grew up and eventually became a lawyer.
Yeah, well, thanks for this. I think so much of, the Attorney Lounge is about kind of paying it forward and letting the wisdom kind of trickle down, and everybody comes to life a little bit differently. I came to the law kind of by accident. I was a pre-med major, and I was going to school with a lot of other pre-med majors, and we're all going to, make our parents proud. At least the Indians of us were going to make our parents proud. And about halfway through college, I decided I couldn't just be doing the science stuff all the time. And, I was more interested in some of the policy issues and writing and, kind of learning about what's going on in the world, amongst other things, just because it became relevant later in my life. There were 2 wars going on in the world. And I'm like, now, both of them, I was kind of following and thinking about what the implications were for U.S. foreign policy, considering, what the differences are based on just the quirk of fate about where we are born. We live different lives, have different opportunities. And so all of those ideas kind of lit this fire of, maybe going to law school. So I told my parents I would go to law school for a year. Maybe I'll get my degree, and then I'll think about whether to go back to medical school.
Wow. How did that go over?
Well, it's been about 30 years and still waiting.
Yeah. I'd say it turned out pretty well, but
yeah, I don't know. I'm going to invite my dad onto the next podcast, and maybe you can convince him.
I'd love to hear. Yeah.
Yeah. So, so I went to law school at Emory in Atlanta, and what I figured out through law school, amongst other things, is at least in terms of the practice of law, was I really enjoyed making an argument and standing up, what we call the stand-up experience, and trial advocacy.
Mm-hmm.
Yep. And of course, the law school encourages that, but it's not always the path that people take. Obviously, there's so many other areas of law. And so I took a path. I went to a firm in Wilmington, Delaware, doing their corporate chancery litigation practice. And, it was a very prestigious job. And I didn't know anything about the law. I didn't have any family who, practicing lawyers or anything. So you kind of follow where the system kind of pushes you. And
Mm.
I had a taste of big law firm life versus summer associate. And I realized that, you know, I wasn't getting that gratification that I thought I could get at law school. On it just so happens that I think he was a counsel or a partner at that firm, said, if this isn't what you want to do, then and you want to be in court, then you should go into criminal law, because that's
Wow.
what's going to get you into court.
That's pretty amazing. So
And
you, at that point, you're at a big firm. Most first year associates are not getting much courtroom experience. Is that kind of this
yeah,
what you were?
yeah,
You know?
I wouldn't get courtroom experience, particularly in that very small chancery practice
Mm.
in Delaware, probably for 8 or 9 years
Wow.
now.
Yeah.
And there's not a lot of like arbitration and other kind of alternative dispute stuff to get that experience. So I saw a long road that, medical school was more appealing than, writing memos for
Right.
8 years. Um,
But that's
I will
and
say,
that's a,
yeah.
oh, go ahead. No.
No, I was just going to say that like everyone else, like all the other summers and the, the junior associates, they were all brilliant. And I certainly had the kind of imposter syndrome of like, these people all wanted to be here. I kind of ended up here, and, maybe I don't want it enough. And there was some element of that self-editing of, I didn't want it that much. The money was good to pay off law school, but the, the gratification, both of being my best, exercising my best talents and
Mhm.
being something that I could be excellent at. Uh, I didn't see that path clearly. And if I had, maybe I would have, stuck it out. But
Yep.
instead I left, and I came back to Boston, where I had gone to high school. And I joined a DA's office in Middlesex County.
So that's a one of the. I mean, I applaud you for that, and I think it's a good lesson too, because it's sort of like one step back, two steps forward. I mean, knowing now, like looking back on your career, how things turned out, I mean, I think that was a great path. You look at where you're at today, but at that point in time, that's got to be tough because I'm sure you're taking a pretty significant pay cut uh, to to make that move.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And it was a tough decision and a bit of a, feeling of, if I fail, right? Like this was going to relieve a lot of pressure on me, on my parents. They wouldn't be so worried anymore about like whether their kids are going to make it in America. And I should say that they're immigrants from India, and the kind of giving up that path, which is the path that the law school and everything else wants you to go down,
Mhm.
um, was a bit challenging. And, I'm of mixed emotions when I talk to younger attorneys now, because I think if I had stayed maybe even 2 years, I probably would have been able to pay off a lot of bills. And just as a
Yeah.
practice, guiding a life, guiding a career, that really would have helped a lot. Um,
Mhm.
but, I was resonating in my brain was like so many people who say, don't wait to do what it is that you want to do. Don't wait till tomorrow because you might not get that chance. So, you
Yeah.
know, that was ultimately why I said, okay, and I applied to every DA's office in Massachusetts, the AG's office. Like I wanted to be in a courtroom, and, the government agencies that I had known of were like on TV, the prosecutor. So,
Yeah.
um, I joined the prosecutor's office.
I think there's a lot of. I mean, I think it's true not just of young attorneys. I think there's a lot of you know older, not just attorneys, but people in all professions that sort of think about once you build that infrastructure of your early life, you get married, you get a house, you get a dog, you get some kids. Now you're carrying a lot of infrastructure, and that ability to sort of make those adjustments in your career becomes harder and harder the longer you go. And so to have that vision kind of early in your career to say, this is really not my best self. This is kind of not what I envision. And to make that change kind of when you did was, was, I mean, I guess I just applaud you for that, because that's not common that people would make that step, and not choose the path of just getting the highest salary and making the most money. And at that point too, you probably, you got student debt, you got things that you're trying to take care of. So, and I mean, you're pointing it out too. You got like family dynamics at play as well, and the respect of your peers, and like, why are you went to Emory? Why are you working at the DA's office? So that's fascinating that you made that switch at
Yeah,
that
I
point in
will
your
say
career.
just on that point, it gets easier to make kind of non-traditional decisions the more you make them. And I think, when I was 18, I made that first, I had the courage to tell my parents that I'm going to double major and, maybe I won't be applying to medical school this year,
Yeah.
18, 19, whatever. So like, it was relatively young. And then a couple of years later, it's, maybe I'm going to go to law school, and which was also, took some, uh, courage. Not that, I'm not on a battlefield, but like in terms of making a life decision based on the best information that you have, based on where it is that you want to go, and kind of what you think you can do that might be good for the world. I mean, and that was kind of an animating kind of principle in going
Yep.
to the DA's office.
Um, so fast forwarding then a little bit, so you're at the DA's office and you start your career there. How did that, progress in terms of opportunities ultimately to getting to the U.S. Attorney's office?
Yeah. So, in hindsight, it couldn't have been a better time to join, the folks there, not only because there had actually been some recent high profile cases out of that office, national cases, international cases. And, um, and some of the people who I worked with when I first joined, became, mentors and friends, and they didn't know me from Adam. I had no ins, not really having been in the industry, but the first day I went into court, I was in Lowell District Court in Massachusetts, and stood up in front of the judge, literally day one, and was able to make like a bail argument. And that was more activity that was more significant than anything I had done in law school or otherwise. And it was really gratifying. So I immediately caught the bug of, I'm representing the people right now, and I am trying to protect them and trying to do justice here. I'm not trying to make money or anything. And that was, so I caught the infection at that point, and I stayed at
Did you
the
win?
DA's office.
Did you win
Yeah.
your?
Well, there's a funny story about that. I tried that the bail argument. I don't know if there's anything called winning. In fact, most at the time, and I think it's still the case, that the judge is going to do whatever he or she wants to do, regardless of the argument that you're going to make, because they have seen a lot more than you have as a young prosecutor. And now a lot of my friends are those judges, and I suspect that's what the situation is.
Yeah.
But I will say that I also tried cases, at the end of the criminal prosecution, and I lost maybe my first dozen trials.
Wow. Really?
And so you talk about, two steps back, and I'm not sure if I had gone to a law firm like Snell, Wilmer, if I lost a dozen trials, whether I would, be gainfully employed.
It might be Al Chakravarty at law,
Exactly. And, at no point did I think it's because I am doing a bad job, but I could clearly be doing a better job. And so I did all sorts of self-editing. I changed my vocal cadence. I adopted the Boston accent, to try to sound like more like the people there.
Wow.
I
Interesting.
did like and it was like every little tweak in order to become more effective in my communication. And it was a opportunity for self-reflection. But what I realized was, after the fact, is it really had very little to do with me. I was a messenger. But the cases that go to trial in Lowell District Court are the cases that are going to be very hard to prove. And many of those trials were bench trials where the judge had already signaled what he was going to do in the case. And so it was a function of savvy attorneys on the other side saying, this is a case that will go to trial, and I'll do the best job I can for my client. and the
Yep.
government can't do anything about it.
So
So,
you probably got some
um,
savvy defense attorneys with a lot of experience that understand, you know, they're not playing their cards in front of you and they're saying good luck.
exact, that's exactly right. And,
Yeah.
and they did it nice. Like I realized I could be very gracious to them, and I was learning I just wanted reps, right? Like,
Mm.
every trial I was learning a ton. And I thought I had a chance every trial, even though
Yep.
I may not have. And what I learned is it wasn't about the accent. It wasn't about the clothes. It wasn't about, how organized I was. It was about being kind of true to myself and just, practicing the craft of being a trial lawyer, marshaling your facts. You don't get a lot of time to prep your witnesses in a
Mm.
busy criminal court in the state level. So it was just a formative experience for me. And I learned that there are a lot of externalities that you can't control, and you should focus on what you can control. And just a tremendous experience. And I
Yeah.
thrived. I loved going to work every day.
That's amazing too. I
And
mean,
then
because
so,
you're really getting a chance to think on your feet. I mean, you're not sitting in in an office where you're, writing briefs all day and doing depot prep and all that sort of stuff. I mean, you're the spotlight is on you and you got to think quickly. So it's probably fun, but at the same time, like your learning curve has got to be just through the roof.
yeah, I think that's right. And it's a bit of it's a sad commentary about our criminal justice system that in most cities and counties around the country, there's, you have junior lawyers representing the government in these cases to kind of move the cases through. And there's not a lot of time to be really deliberative about, what's the best thing to do in this case? Where should the law go in this case? And I did, even though I was in that machine, I did tend to take some extra pride in, staying up late in order to write that brief and really learn what the law is, because chances are nobody else in the courtroom really knew it. And
Mhm.
that way I could use the law as an ally to make to try to bring justice in a situation, which it taught me that you use the tools that you have at your disposal. And the law was one that was unfortunately not as utilized in a busy kind of court. But I had a great experience there. After a couple of years, but 2.5 years, I went to the state attorney general's office,
Mhm.
along with a lot of the people who had been at the DA's office with me for years. They also went there, and there I did proactive investigations in their criminal division, which were like wiretap investigations and use of undercover operatives. And we were kind of doing like stings and in a variety of different kind of sins. There was organized crime. So any kind of crime that would be organized, including drug trafficking and guns and gambling and prostitution and all of that stuff we do. And it developed a real connection with the investigators as well as the attorneys that did that
Mhm.
work, because we were embedded. And it was I didn't think you could find a better job at the DA's office, but that may have been it at the time.
Mm.
And then 9/11 happened, and all of my colleagues sprung into action doing various things, investigating that. That's in light of I was still in Boston, in light of the Boston connection.
Yep.
And after all of that happened, I really felt that this balance between civil liberties and national security, that there aren't many people who have an experience grounded in the Constitution, like myself, who wanted to help, protect people while at the same time protect civil liberties of all of us.
Yep.
And so that prompted me to go to the FBI. And after a lengthy background check process, I joined the FBI's Office of General Counsel, and was practicing national security law there for a while.
So was that, I mean, this is sort of in the wake of 9/11. Are you working on things related to that case at that time?
Yeah, yeah. Basically, I had the national security portfolio. They stood up a new branch, just national security law, which was terrorists and spies, essentially. So there was a few espionage matters, and a lot of anti-terrorism investigations related to, at the time, Al Qaeda. And the very frequently, what the FBI and the other intelligence agencies like the CIA and stuff, they will look into matters that don't rise to the level of a criminal prosecution. And this is all stuff that I had no idea of until I went there. And they're gathering intelligence so that we know what's going on, so that we can act using all the tools of national power. And in that process, the actors, the operators, and the agents, they often need legal advice on how to do something in a way that is going to, keep them legally protected, and is also mindful of privacy rights and the like, but whether it be here or abroad. And that's where I really flexed this muscle of, I thought I knew constitutional law, at least, Fourth Amendment, Sixth Amendment, First Amendment pretty well. But then, that was all tested by a whole set of executive orders and a bunch of other body of law that went into national security law. And it was a tremendous experience. At one point, I was detailed over to the Office of Intelligence Policy and Review, which is a Department of Justice entity at Main Justice. It's now called the Office of Intelligence in the National Security Division at Main Justice. And there, what I practiced before the FISA court, the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act court, Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court, with these applications for wiretapping and other techniques, search warrants related to foreign intelligence gathering. In recent years, that has become much more prominent, but for a long time, at least in the kind of public discourse, but for a long time, nobody really knew what that was.
Mm-hmm.
And everybody liked it that way. In that process, there were several terrorism cases, national terrorism cases, where I was doing the FISA applications for and getting the information, which was later ultimately used in federal criminal trials because a case turned criminal. But it was a interesting world where the national security apparatus that this country has always had after 9/11 kind of merged with the criminal apparatus. And in many ways, I think that was for the better. And it was kind of prescient for, cases that I did later in my career. Ultimately, I came back to Boston. I was in Washington at that time, and I came back to Boston in about 2005 to go to the U.S. Attorney's Office, where in light of this experience that I had down there, and also my prosecutorial experience up in Boston, I was fortunate enough to get a position at the U.S. Attorney's Office in the National Security Division.
Yeah. I kind of remember that time. I mean, I'm a corporate lawyer, so I'm not immersed in sort of all the national security stuff, but I remember at the time, I mean, everything kind of changed for us at that time. And this sort of debate over national security versus privacy rights, and what does the government have the right to do? And really this strong push to sort of impede on individual liberty, and privacy in the name of national security, and really difficult debates at that time because, the feeling of, we've been attacked on American soil and we need to do whatever it takes to sort of, remedy this situation, if you want to say it that way. I mean, there's some similarities, I think, not to get too deep into things, but kind of what's going on with Israel right now and Palestine, and some of the things that go on in terms of what you can do, and understanding the implications of your actions in the wake of something that's that traumatic, and kind of protecting, constitutional rights and not going too far. That had to be weighing heavy on you and the entire department as you're sort of walking through all this stuff.
Yeah, for sure it did. In fact, as it was all happening, there was a famous Harvard law professor who had come to my college when I was in college, now it's 10 years out of college when all that happened. But I remember this guy coming to college and talking about, whether Israel should be able to torture somebody in order to get information that is going to protect it from being attacked again by a terrorist. And it seemed so abstract when I was 18 years old, right?
Yeah.
We weren't living, even though there were wars going on, I didn't think of that. And then fast forward, to post 9/11, and then I'm at FBI headquarters or the CIA, and I'm dealing with these very same issues.
Mm-hmm.
And at least in relation to the U.S., the use of, these.
You got like waterboarding. I remember waterboarding was a big,
which I had nothing to do. And so, but
that type of investigative
exactly.
sort of, I'm sure they're coming to you saying, can we use these techniques, right? And is this going to hold
Yeah.
up?
Well, that one, they did not come to me because I would have given them a different answer. But yeah, I mean, Guantanamo is going on. A lot of my colleagues are going down there, frequently in order to help stand up these tribunals, which, just looking at the law does not seem very well thought out. If you're a criminal practitioner who's protecting U.S., constitutional rights, the idea of these tribunals was so foreign to,
Yeah.
you're going to deprive somebody of liberty or worse, maybe based on, these. And so that got me starting into thinking about, well, what are all these alternative forums and these alternative tribunals around the world? Kind of like that Harvard professor was saying when I was in college. And then, to your point, fast forward another, 20 years now, and exactly that situation is manifesting in a way that's on the global stage. But absolutely, I had to deal with thorny issues, not that one particularly. And, an example is like a drone strike on a known terrorist in a foreign country, assuming that the rules of engagement can approve it. Would that be an appropriate response to within the U.S. legal kind of constructs? And often what we found is there was no law that squarely addresses that point, right? And so then policymakers are often making choices based on that. So it was really exciting to deal with a lot of these kind of very tangible issues, which, you're reading about in the papers every day. And I was one of thousands of people in the U.S. government who were dealing with various aspects of that.
Yeah. And so then that, and I'm probably skipping ahead in your career here, but I know that a lot of that then came into play, I think, right in the Boston Marathon bombing case. So if I recall, you were involved almost the second that happened in terms of advising law enforcement of what you can do and how you were sort of tracking down who did it, what you could use, what information you could gather, and how this was going to be ultimately preserved and usable, in court down the road. So I know I skipped probably a big chunk of your career there, kind of leading to that point, but kind of walk us through that, kind of when that happened and kind of your involvement with that.
Yeah, it's a perfect segue, actually. Yeah, so I had just finished trying another case. It was actually a retrial of a case that I had done. I'll talk about it in a while, involving the Rwandan genocide. And just finished that case, and it was, all consuming for several months, not years. And I had just taken some time off with my family, and it was Marathon Monday when I came back into the office for the first time. And as you may know, and some of our listeners might know, that week is school vacation week. So a lot of the folks in the office were out for school vacation with their families because it was long planned.
Mm-hmm.
Mine were small, so I was able to come in that week, and I was catching up, sending emails out, had the marathon on in the background in the break room, and, go in, grab some coffee. And that's when I saw the plumes of smoke at the marathon, and immediately knew that was, a terrorist attack.
Wow.
Didn't understand the full, context. I had done several terrorism cases before in the Boston area at that time. Between the time I came back, 2005 to 2013, it was 8 years. And I had done several terrorism matters, including a high profile case in which there were magazines, this Al-Qaeda magazine, which had bomb making instructions. Like, this is how you make a bomb, that was very similar to the bombs that exploded at the marathon. So all of that was going through my head when I saw that. And I had a nominal position at the DOJ of being the crisis management coordinator. So I felt like I had some agency to do something, and had been working with the FBI, particularly for the last 8 years, even after I left the FBI as an employee. And so I had some strong connections there, and immediately when I saw that, I ran over to the FBI office in Boston, which was probably half a mile away. And there I saw all my friends at the bureau, and we basically had to stand up a command post and say, okay, how are we going to address this?
Wow. Real quick, I want to recognize our sponsor, Array. Array handles all the details of litigation so that you can focus on winning your case. They take care of forensic collection, e-discovery, managed review, record retrieval, court reporting, legal staffing and recruiting, trial support, you name it. I'm the general counsel at Array, so I may be a little bit biased, but I was also a client before I started working there too. I've used them on various matters, and they've always delivered. If you're involved in a lawsuit, make Array your first call, and they'll help you get organized right from the beginning. You can reach out to me or visit trustarray.com. Now, back to the pod. I mean, I think you quite literally just walked over to the FBI.
Well, I didn't walk. I ran. But yes, no, and part of it was, it wasn't like self-deployment in the classic sense. I, talked to my office of, look, this just happened. They need our skill set right now. We work these investigations together all the time.
Mm-hmm.
And if we are not there, then we will not be getting the information necessary to be making the decisions that the Attorney General and the people in Washington are going to need. And because I had worked in Washington, I was very, very acutely aware of the information flow and the demands. I had also incidentally worked on the Times Square bombing that had occurred a few years earlier, and was very acutely aware of the demands the DOJ was going to have on us about information. And the only way that you can get that information is to be present and to be engaged and to be valued. And that's where, I'm kind of jumping to the end before I get through the story, but I did feel like I got over the FBI and I see these are people who I work with every day for the last 8+ years. And the people on the phone or at the other end of the classified secure video conference are people that I worked with for years prior to coming back to Boston. And the state police detectives and their brass and Ed Davis and the Boston police, these are all people that I had worked with personally from the beginning of my career when I started the Lowell DA's office. And I realized if I am not the right person to be able to manage these relationships in what in Boston was a very, it's a very controversial time of relationship building and the Whitey Bulger stuff. And there was a lot of fractures between the various agencies and I had good relationships with all of them because I had produced for all of them and helped them put cases together and, bring them to successful conclusions. So I did feel a little empowered by my background and the fact that I was kind of nominally the person that is responsible for responding in a crisis. So, at some times in your life, you feel like you're in the right place at the right time. And that's how I felt myself.
Yeah. I mean, for you to be just back in the office that day, and then I'm sure, to have it on TV and to see it happen and for the adrenaline to kick in and just run into the fire, and to be with people that you already had a relationship with and to jump into that is really, fascinating and to be, like you say, to be the right place at the right time, and not just for yourself, but for all of us and all the families who cared so much. I mean, that was, it's just a interesting sequence of events that you happen to be in that place at that time. So you get there, and immediately get into like, what do you start doing? I mean, you're at that point, you're trying to, you've got just massive amounts of information. Adrenaline is kicking in. Everybody's trying to figure out what to do. What do you do?
Yeah. So much of what a lawyer does in these things is to be the voice of reason and to take a deep breath. And so that's part of what I did, in that, we have been through similar situations in terms of how this apparatus, the law enforcement apparatus turns towards investigating something. And we do it as a team, and that team is a lot of prosecutors. I happened to be there because I was the one who was physically there.
Mm-hmm.
But there was a whole team behind me and soon, alongside of me, and all these agents from not only the FBI, but the various other agencies just kept kind of flowing in, and the command post started getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And so much of kind of my role was the same role that I have now as a lawyer, not in the government, which is how can I best help my client get to the result that they're trying to achieve? And in this case, it was, justice. It was at that time, public safety, because we had terrorists on the loose. We didn't know the full extent. We didn't know, whether this was, a foreign-based mission or whether it was something that was homegrown. And we had a lot of questions we had to answer, and we had certain legal tools that we had at our disposal to be able to get the information to figure that out. And so that's how very much I viewed my role, was to how do I help all of these people who will steadily increase over time, a ton of resources being devoted to this. How do I help them get what they need? And so that means providing them counsel. It means telling them what their options are in terms of, what kind of legal process we might be able to prepare to get certain data, to tell them what, the law says about things like, can you detain somebody and not give them the Miranda rights and talk to them, interview them if you're trying to prevent a bomb from blowing up, the public safety exception. So there are a whole host of kind of legal aspects that they needed to have definitive direction on before we can kind of go through and first find the bad guys and then hopefully bring them to justice. And in most cases of any, domestic terrorism, there hadn't been successful prosecutions through the end, often because there was no defendant, or for a variety of reasons, it didn't emerge after 9/11. There hadn't been a terrorist attack like this, where we would test all that full panoply of tools at our disposal that I had been working in that space since I joined the FBI those years ago.
Yeah, I mean, your entire career was kind of building to this moment, it sort of feels like. And I imagine emotions are running high, and I have to imagine there was some intense conversations with people that were saying, I don't care what the law says. Like, I mean, this was very personal attack on a city that has a lot of pride. I'm sure there were people that I'm sure it wasn't easy to be giving legal advice in that moment.
Yeah, I think that it wasn't so much the team of investigators that was the issue. The problem is we're all human beings, and we all have this emotional side, and you see, the children are dead, and that there are all these victims and survivors at the hospitals their lives are being dramatically changed. And you don't know whether, the attacks are over. And that sense of remorse, of empathy, of fear, of anger, all of those emotions are human emotions that you have to deal with. And I think it is probably true that prosecutors are they're both trained to, and over time they develop an ability to divorce themselves personally from those while they are performing their task. But those feelings definitely kind of sit inside. And I think during that time, I was conscious of the fact that those feelings existed. But I also knew that our country, frankly, without sounding too ostentatious about this, but what we were going to do in the next few hours, days, and longer, were going to be scrutinized very closely by, the media, by our communities. And I wanted to do the best job that I could possibly do. And I felt that I had to rise to that responsibility and rise to that occasion, because that's what they demanded of us. And so I think most of the investigators, I think, had a similar mindset, where we all were conscious that all of that, it was true and it existed, but we had to stay cool, and we had to kind of go about our business like we knew how to do and that we had done many, many times before.
Yeah. And so I've heard you talk about, so as you start sort of narrowing down, what tools do you have that you're looking at cameras on streets? You're looking at, what information do you have available? I seem to recall too, one of the things you talked about was not um, falsely accusing the wrong person of this, given the heated emotions and things like that, and that was something that, if I recall, you were acutely aware of as well. You're trying to find all this information. You're trying to track down who the bad guys are. You're not wanting information to leak that leads you to the wrong person. Who knows what happens to that person and what alters their life if you end up with accusing the wrong person. Do I have that right? Is that sort of?
Yeah, no, absolutely, absolutely. I mean, it's a whodunit, but I mean, you don't think of the Boston Marathon now, I think, as a whodunit because the evidence at the end of the day was very clear. But at the time, we didn't have all of that evidence, and we knew we would get like these three prongs. We'd have videos and pictures that hopefully would show us who the bad guy was or show us the vicinity of where the bombs blew up. We knew that we would have the actual shrapnel and other kind of detritus on the street that goes back to the bombs, and, forensically analyzing those, we were hoping to get fingerprints or something else that would identify the person. And we knew that there was likely to be a cell phone or more that would allow us to use cell phone records to help find out if somebody was using a phone at the time. And within the second day, when we saw a video, still picture of a person who appeared to be in the exact location where the bombs blew up, all on a cell phone, then that reaffirmed our idea that the cell phone evidence is going to help us identify who that person is. And then we can be very careful and precise about how we're investigating that person, as opposed to casting a broad net or sending out pictures to the world about who we're looking for. And I think this idea of misidentification was something that I was always acutely aware of because of the same reasons I joined the FBI after 9/11, which is, abuses by the government or kind of a misidentification or a false accusation could do a lot more harm to our country than, just waiting a little while longer to make sure you're making a better choice.
Mhm.
And that's not always the case. You have to deal with the circumstances. But at least going into that Tuesday and Wednesday, we felt confident that a methodical review of the cell phone records and the forensic evidence, which was being analyzed at the Quantico FBI lab, the two plane flights were going down every day, and they were doing just an amazing job of turning around preliminary results pretty quickly, that we thought we were going to have a pretty good idea of what the people look like and hopefully get their names.
Mhm.
Unfortunately, by that Thursday, so now 4 days later, the city is still on edge. A decision was made to decide whether to release the pictures because we had not yet identified who these guys were.
Mhm.
So whether to release the photographs to the general public, so maybe somebody would see them and identify them, or to allow our investigation to keep running. And I absolutely wanted the investigation to keep running so that we wouldn't make a false identification. And also because we didn't want the bad guys to know that we knew who they were
Yeah.
or what they looked like. And so that the kind of noose was getting narrower. And there were a lot of very spirited discussions about that from, the highest levels. And ultimately a decision was made to release the images of the people we suspected to be the bombers, person who at the time in the command post were called White Hat and Black Hat. And those images were released. The bad guys saw themselves in those images and decided to kind of spring into action again. Ultimately, they needed another firearm, so they went to MIT's campus, and which is close to their home in Cambridge, and tragically assassinated Sean Collier, trying to get his gun, which
Mhm.
because of him and the way that he had secured his firearm, they were unable to get it. And he saved lives in that moment. You realize that just doing your job well saves lives when you're in public service. And he's just an inspiration.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's amazing.
And so they get they can't get his gun. Um, they had carjack, Danny Meng, and then Danny Meng escapes famously at one gas station in Cambridge. He runs across the street. He places a phone call. He tells the license plate number of his car, and be on the lookout, goes out for the Mercedes SUV. And then a short time later in Watertown, Massachusetts, which is, maybe 10 minutes away from that place in Cambridge where he escaped, the Watertown police come upon the vehicle, and a shootout ensues. And there's a lot of detail to that, which I can get into, but I think time permitting, and also it's been dramatized so much. I don't feel that I will do it justice in a podcast, but amazingly, um, just exciting, the kind of events. But once right after Sean Collier's death, just on a personal note, I had been up straight running on adrenaline since the bombing, and kind of been at the command post that whole time. All of these developments had emerged. And once the decision was made to kind of release the images, I realized, okay, now, my plan of kind of doing this methodical investigation to find the bad guy, I've been overruled essentially. So I'm going to go get some rest. And there were people to my left and right, very dear friends who were AUSAs who were, could pick up the ball and keep going. And so I headed home. And when I get home, I, get ready to put my head down. And then I got a call saying there's this shootout in Watertown. And, it was variously described as having AK-47s and bombs and grenades and like a war zone. And so I got, back in the car and came right back into the office.
I recall watching that live,
Yeah.
on the news. I mean, it was fascinating to see that play out in person. Had you quite literally not slept? I mean, because I don't even know how that's humanly possible. But were you going? Was
Yeah.
that the first time you had been home in 4 days or whatever?
That was the first time I had been home.
Yeah.
And I certainly didn't have a bed to sleep on. I probably caught a cat nap here and there at the FBI, but I was just permanently there. And I will say, it's something you have to be worried about anytime you're in a kind of crisis situation of just overwork. And there were some agents who were like me, just you could visibly see how drained we all were. But adrenaline is an amazing thing. And if you think about it, like your career kind of points you to certain things. And I realized that, and they did too, that this is, this has to be our finest hours, like our forefathers, like this is our time, at least for this incident, we have to do our absolute best. And I think that's what kind of carried us through, but it was absolutely draining.
Yeah.
That Thursday night, basically there was the shootout. So it was Friday when, the entire city was locked down because the upshot of the shootout was the older brother, he died that night. His identification led to the identification of the other brother. And so there was a manhunt looking for that other brother. And I think for 19 hours of manhunt. And during this whole time I've been, and during the course of the day, I'm either at the FBI or I'm drafting legal process and then bringing it to the judge. There was one judge who issued dozens and dozens of legal process. And so I would go to her home, or, wherever she was at the courthouse in order to get these things signed. And, it was like constantly keeping her updated on kind of where are you going to be at a certain time? Because we might need to see you again to get more legal process. And, at that time on Friday, we're waiting for a body, hopefully a live body that we can hopefully bring to justice, through the court system. And, eventually, fast forward, he is found in the boat at Dave Hannaberry's backyard. Incredible scene there. There's a fusillade of shots that go into the boat, by the responding police, and he survives. He's rehabilitated both on the scene. The agents immediately provide first aid, and then he's taken to the hospital. And we make arrangements with the judge to meet at the hospital the next morning to do, actually Monday morning to do the initial appearance. And so that's the first time where we have a defendant. I drafted complaint to have him brought before the court. And then now, finally, after that week of being up, essentially, I rested a little bit over the weekend. We made arrangements on kind of how we were going to deal with the initial appearance. And then we did the initial appearance. Now, all during that time, now we can talk about it because it's publicized, but there were other agents who were in there talking to him and trying to find out what happened. And we ultimately decided not to use those statements that he made to them as part of the prosecution.
Were you aware of the questions at that time? Were they consulting with you, or is that?
No, it was, I was acutely aware of the fact that if they're doing a public safety interview, and even though public safety is part of my mission, I want to make sure that if we're going to prosecute this guy, that there's no taint or anything else that can come from that on the prosecution. So I very deliberately, avoided all of that. It was literally agents were walking out as I was walking in to the hospital.
Wow. And at what point in this whole process do you realize, or do you know the whole time you're going to be the one that's going to be in charge of this prosecution? You're going to be the one at trial, or does that come up at this point?
I don't think anybody talked about it. Any of us talked about it. I suspect the U.S. attorney did, maybe the attorney general. I can't say, I certainly wanted to follow this case through and, feel it's the privilege of my career to be able to follow it through. But, those decisions were not going to be made by me at the time on the location. I would say that it reminds me how important it is and how much influence, like the U.S. attorney had, and, the first assistant and my own supervisor, the head of the national security unit, who had worked with me for years on all these other cases, that when you do, a good job, then hopefully that builds trust so that they will trust you with it. And they saw that I was probably the right person at the right time, at least for that week. And I had tried these cases. I had tried the only other, terrorism case in this vein, in Massachusetts. So I thought objectively I was the right person, but you never know what the staffing situation is going to be like, whether it be in a government agency or in the private sector. And so that's where you realize that the people who are your mentors and your friends really have an incredible influence on your career path and, what opportunities you get to do. And now I'm very aware of that as I give work to associates or other partners, that I want to set them up for success and success for the clients. But at the same time, I'm aware of how much influence I'm having on them just by virtue of the work that I'm giving them.
But now there's a whole nother pressure on you. You're now responsible for trying this case. And so I think we'll probably need another episode to walk through like just the entire trial process, but then that's got to be, you've gone through this entire investigation period. You're hardly sleeping. You've got an unbelievable amount of pressure on you. Now you turn around, like you say, it's basically straight into the prosecution phase of this thing. And that's got to weigh on you pretty heavily as well.
Yeah. There's definitely an element of, I don't want to screw up. Right. And when it was a whodunit, it's hard. Only way you screw up is you don't figure out who it is. So like you could take gambles in different ways in order to try to, find the guy, as we did with the pictures. But ultimately we found the defendant, and then by that time, the evidence was much stronger that we have the right guy. So the pressure is, I think, greater that we need to bring this to justice. And the only way that we will likely be derailed from that is if we screw up. right? If there's something about our legal system that we don't honor, and if since there's so much scrutiny of this case, and unlike the 9/11 case and other cases where there was a plea or something, if this case goes to trial, the world will be watching how we put this case together. So there is a lot of pressure for sure. But, sure, I had responsibility for this case, but others did as well. And
Yeah.
the beauty of working on big things, significant things, is you don't do it alone. There's nobody who does any of this stuff alone. And I was certainly immersed, and my whole life was revolving around the case. But I had, several people on my side to the left and right who were equally committed and, were brilliant, and the agents that I worked with as well. And it was really, moving the aircraft carrier in a direction where we're all kind of rowing in the same directions, essentially.
Yeah, and as we kind of run out of time here, so
Yeah.
I want to, like I say, I could ask you a million questions about the trial itself. Here's a silly one I got for you.
Yeah.
How I think it's fascinating to look at the the drawings that they do in the courtroom.
Yeah.
What did you think of that? Like, what, you're now a national figure. They're doing courtroom drawings of you. I mean, you got to be on, I mean, national news constantly, interviews, like all this sort of stuff. Like your whole life, like, is flipped upside down at this point. What is that
Yeah.
like,
I
kind of
mean,
living through an event like that?
so, uh, yeah, the drawings were like, that's when I felt like I had made it as a lawyer. And it's completely, has no relation to being a good lawyer. But I'm like, if I'm be memorialized on crayons or charcoal, or then, it must be important. But I realized that it's all a function of federal court and, not having cameras in the courtroom, and the drawings don't really have to reflect anything about reality.
Mm-hmm.
And, as we see recently in high profile cases where these drawings are often kind of distorted images of people.
Yeah.
And, but it was the idea of attention to what I was doing. And, when I'm getting a coffee and, they're taking pictures of you like that, I realized that we're at a different time now where the story is not always the substance of what's happening in the courtroom, but it's all of this kind of drama around trying to humanize these people to be able to be voyeuristic in many ways.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know that that's healthy for our, criminal justice system, our, judicial process, or for our society generally. And so I tried to kind of block that out. And, there's many smart lawyers have told me over the years that the job of the lawyer is not to be the star of the show.
Yep. Yep.
And so that's how I view, like, our job was to present evidence, and we tried really hard to do that in a way that would be smart, efficient, convey what we're trying to do, make the system look good, make it look like everybody, the defense is being able to do their job and do a vigorous cross-examination. But to show that the way that the U.S. justice system works can bring justice even to a, notorious, person who is presumed innocent until he's found guilty and ultimately given a punishment.
Yep.
So we took a lot of pride in doing that, and, ultimately got the right result.
And tell me now too, like, one of the interesting anecdotes that you talked about is this is all done. You lead this trial, you prosecute him, convict him. You go through the sentencing phase, and then you end up meeting him in prison. Is that, am I remembering this correctly? And you had a decision to make on whether to speak with him at this point. Can you remind me of that story?
Yeah, just for a variety of reasons, which I can't go into all the details. I was at a prison where he was, and he saw me walking by, and we had just spent 6 months together, every day, you know, as- you know, right across the table from each other, or right next to each other. And And I had met most of his friends in, that he's ever had in the United States,
Mm-hmm.
and his teachers, and a lot of people in his circle. And I felt like I had a pretty good understanding of who he was outside of just what the evidence of the crime was, um, to the extent that that was relevant. And I saw his antics in court every day, whether there was a jury there or not. Um, and when you're in the physical proximity of somebody, you feel like you get a sense of them, just kind of through nonverbal communication. Not that I ever wanted to or tried to speak with him at any point, but the case was on appeal when I saw him. He saw me, and he did motion over to me and invited me in to speak with him.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where there is this kind of this kind of voyeuristic influencer world, social media world, where wouldn't it be interesting? Wouldn't this be a great Netflix special to show the conversation between an accused and the accuser, or a prosecutor and defendant, or what have you? And I'm copywriting that idea in case Netflix tries to take that. But I have ethical duties not to communicate with somebody who at the time was still represented by counsel for purposes of the appeal in a matter where the government was still representing. So I ultimately kind of chose not to do that. But the idea of having a candid conversation is one which maybe in other countries and other legal systems they would do, and maybe would do at the cost of an open public trial.
Mm-hmm.
But that's not our way. And so far I think that has worked well, particularly because I think it would be unjust to give him a platform to do something after causing so much pain to so many people, and not being able to do it the right way in the first place.
Yeah, I mean, I respect you for doing that, and that had to be sort of tough with personally, the fascination with doing it, but kind of keeping your head in that moment and not doing that. We're running up against time here. I know you were not portrayed in the movie. Real quick, you were you consulted on the movie, but you were not in the movie. Was that by design?
The Mark Wahlberg movie, I did talk to Mark Wahlberg and Peter Berg. They told me that this movie is not about the the lawyers. It's about the first responders, and they created this kind of. I will say, and maybe this will change. I have never watched the movie, so maybe I will at some point. But I have done conversations like this where I do think it's important that people know different aspects of what happened. But as we have learned today, it takes a long time to go through in granular detail a lot of what happened. So you kind of have to bite off chunks at a time.
There's so much meat on the bone there, I mean, to talk about, and it's a fascinating case. I mean, congratulations to you and the way that it was handled with such professionalism to come to the conclusion that it did, which we all wanted to see, and to preserve that from the very beginning, to have just your career leading up to that moment in time. You literally run over to the FBI and see this thing all the way through, and it's just an amazing story. And we could talk about it for hours, but I know we need to wrap it up. You have a successful practice today at Snell and Wilmer, and so for anybody that's interested in getting in touch with you, where can they get in touch with you at?
Yeah, so I left the government not long after this case and the appeal, the first set of appeals, and moved out west, and found the wonderful people at Snell and Wilmer, just a great firm, because which, like the other places I had worked, it was really good work, but really great people to do it with. And so that has kind of been this guiding principle. And I'm back in Boston now, and doing a lot of kind of white collar work, investigations for companies, and helping individuals who might be involved with a governmental investigation, whether it be SEC or DOJ or one of these things. And so I'm available at Snell Wilmer, or you can Google me, and the search engine optimization will find me. I should also add, I also do cybersecurity and data privacy, which is was a component of my investigative practice when I was with the government and at the FBI. And so now I'm doing that to help private clients.
Yeah, and you have some practice in crypto as well, which I would say is fascinating to me too. I'd love to talk to you about that. I mean, talk about an area of law, kind of like earlier in your career, that's not really well developed. We could talk about that for an hour as well.
Yeah, well, and maybe we will. I very much enjoy the kind of the challenges with not having clarity as to which way to go. And it does remind me a lot of what the national security directives were for the government. Now the kind of lack of regulation or the increasing regulation by ad hoc is kind of, it's a brave new world. I did have some recent, dealings in the Sam Bankman-Fried matter. I had a client who was a potential witness in that case. And dealt with the Southern District of New York, and I'm still dealing with FTX for another client. And, it's interesting to see how the private sector, like so much of our life now, it's not government that is controlling, these institutions or these businesses. This is all private sector. And so even, the private sector and the lawyers and the trustees, these are all private sector folks who are controlling the direction of how FTX is kind of rebuilding in the bankruptcy process. And it's just really interesting how we've outsourced a lot of what we think are basic fundamental kind of protections for people to the private sector, like social media companies and big tech. And that is true in the crypto world as well. And so we hope that actions like this will deter other people from, kind of flaunting the rules and doing whatever they want and trying to create a more aggressive standard than protects people.
Yeah, you tend to get, I mean, the regulation and everything is behind the advancement of technology, and it just takes time to catch up. And I think, like I said, we could talk about it. I'm fascinated by that, and I think it's sort of the new frontier of where we're headed and covers so many different areas of the law. So, yeah, we'll save it for another time. I'll let you get on your way.
Sorry, we didn't get through as much as we wanted to today, but it's just, I could talk to you for a long time, Brian, as you know. So
we've had lots of long conversations. Yeah. Well, thank you, Al, for being on the show. Thank you, everyone, for listening. If you're interested in further episodes, please subscribe to the Attorney Lounge podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. I want to thank Array again for sponsoring this podcast today and making it possible. And for more information on them, visit trustarray.com. Thanks, everybody, for tuning in to the Attorney Lounge. Thank you, Al.
Absolutely. Thank you.